Hello, this is Jacob Lawlor, the team lead for the Lawlor Luxury Group, a first team real estate, and I'm very excited to be sharing with you today really the foundational document of a real estate transaction, and that is the residential purchase agreement. Now, this document is a robust document and it changes all the time. So whether this is your first home that you're purchasing or whether this is the 21st home that you're purchasing, they update it at least once a year, oftentimes multiple times per year. And about every 10 years or so, there's a massive update where they totally change everything. Luckily, they just recently did that about a year and a half ago now. So there was a big change. So if you haven't purchased a home since then, this is going to look totally different than the last time that you purchased. And if so, they do update it pretty frequently, at least once a year or so. So I'm going to be going over with you the most recent update to the residential purchase agreement, at least as of the time of recording this, which is December of 2022. So what I have here is a little cover sheet that I like to have a theme to the documents because it is, as of right now, 16 pages of a legally binding contract. So what I have here is kind of a synthesis and kind of how we kind of break it down to really what's most important for you being a home buyer, which is how to get your offer accepted and how to negotiate the best deal possible at the same time. So as a synthesis to this entire thing, really a seller, when they're staring at the 16 pages, when they're selling their home, they really only care about two things. Number one, greed. How much are they going to get? And number two, what I'll just call peace of mind, which is how likely will they actually get it? Now, the contract is 16 pages and there's only really one spot, technically two, where it actually talks about the price or the greed function. So the rest of those 16 pages are going to play into how likely the seller will be to get that and really their peace of mind around it. So that's really what I want to focus on, is the peace of mind to give a seller, but also the peace of mind of you as a home buyer, because the beautiful thing about those 16 pages is it's really built around protections for you being a buyer. So as we're getting started in this home buying process, just know that an offer is just the beginning of the process. It's not the end all be all. There are a tremendous amount of what I'll just call safety valves, or what the contract calls contingencies, to be able to get out of the transaction without losing your initial deposit, which we will get into for this read through in here. But it's important to note it is just the beginning of the process. It's not the end all be all. But what the theme that I like to kind of say is the more you concern a seller, the more you will have to pay for a house. If you think about it logically, if you're selling your home, if you're going to be getting two offers on a property and somebody's going to give you $1 million in a briefcase of cash and just showing it to you there, versus if someone just says, oh, I promise I'm going to give you $1 million, but I have no documentation, I have no peace of mind for you, the seller, which one are you going to choose? The $1 million in briefcase of cash that you can see and verify there, or someone who just says, I promise to you, I'll get it to you on Tuesday, right? So the more peace of mind that you give to a seller through the offer, the more likely it is that they're going to want to work with you and choose your offer amongst the others, or potentially getting you a discount or a better deal the more peace of mind you give them. Because if you, again, think about it logically, if you have two offers on a property, right? If you're selling your home and someone gives you a briefcase of cash for $1 million, but then if somebody else says, well, hey, maybe I'll give you $1 million and 5,000, but I don't really have any documentation, or I have minimal documentation, or maybe I have to get kind of a loan, but my credit scores aren't that great, or anything like that. Are you more likely to take that $1 million certain, or are you willing to give that for that risk, that $5,000? And if you're saying, no, I'd go for that $1 million, okay, cool. Like, so what if they're going to give you potentially $10,000, $20,000, $50,000? At what point does it make sense for you being a seller to take that risk, to take that one offer with maybe limited documentation versus that lower offer with cash? It's safe to say that for every single seller, including yourself if you were selling your home, every seller has a peace of mind value. The challenge is for us helping you get the best deal possible for your home is we don't know what that particular seller's peace of mind is worth to them, but we do know it's worth something. So the better we can position your offer to stand out amongst the others or to stand out in the eyes of a seller, the better value you're going to get for your home. And that's what I want to talk to you about today is how do we get you the best value for that home while still protecting you at the same time, because that's of highest importance to me and the entire team is at the end of the day that you are protected and that you are safe and secure in this transaction. So the more you concern a seller, the more you will have to pay for the home. Now, there's really 9 main items that I personally like to highlight when it comes to the offer. All those 16 pages, boiling it down into 9 main items. Number 1, price. We can't get past that, of course. The whole reason why the seller is selling the home is to help get money for it. So, of course, we got to talk about the greed aspect of it. That's just 1 out of the 9. Escrow time frame. How long will it take for you to be able to complete the transaction? Easy way to think about it. It should be as short as we can possibly make it in order for the lender to get the loan for the money to get in, but also as long as the seller needs and as long as you need in order to make that move as amicable as possible. So one of the first things I do when I'm talking to a listing agent is trying to figure out what is the time frame that that particular seller needs or really wants in order to help move out, and then we want to play around with what's the best way to kind of combine those time frames. Then number 3 is the initial deposit. There is an actual upfront amount of money that we have to bring into escrow, not directly to the seller, but into escrow in a escrow trust account, where we need to bring in an amount within 3 business days. There will be a wire into escrow within 3 business days, unless we change that time frame on the offer. A good kind of general rule, if you will, is about 3% is considered a full or customary deposit, and we can get more into that. Number 4 is the financing type. There are different types of financing, whether that's conventional, which is the default, whether that is FHA financing, whether that's VA financing, whether that's private financing, or even possibly seller financing. So each one of those different types of financing can play to the seller's peace of mind. Conventional is considered the gold standard, if you will, with the least amount of really hoops to jump through. FHA and VA, because they're both government-backed loans, can be seen as a little bit less desirable to a seller and some uneducated listing agents. We could go down that road, but financing type plays into it. Number 5, whether it is a contingency to sell. So if you're purchasing this home, but in order to bring in the funds, you need to sell your current home, that can play into the seller's peace of mind. Easiest general rule for that is we have to convince the seller that your current home is more saleable than their home, because the seller is going to think, well, if you can't buy this home until you sell yours, is it going to take longer, be less potential for me to sell this home to another buyer who doesn't have to quicker than when you can sell your home, if that makes sense? So we have to really position to the seller how valuable your home is and basically give them a listing presentation on your home, on convincing them how saleable it is, to share with them how quickly we're going to be able to get it done. That's number 5. Number 6 are contingency timeframes. Contingencies are those safety valves that I briefly talked about to get out of the transaction. There's really 8 main contingencies that a seller can think about. 3 are the big ones, and that is the loan contingency, your ability to get the loan that you said that you can. Number 2 is the appraisal, to make sure that the home appraises for the amount that we agree upon. Because the bank, let's say you're getting 20% down, which means the bank has to bring in 80% of the funds. The bank needs to verify that they're bringing that 80% on a home that's worth that amount that we're agreeing upon, if that makes sense. And then number 3, the big one, is the investigation of property contingency. You being able to do inspections to make sure the condition of that home matches up with your expectations. And we can get into that. Number 7 is the repair request, or repairs that you request on the offer itself, as well as reports that we request. Again, the more that we request, the more concerned a seller could be, because they're thinking, well, oh my goodness, if they're asking all of this up front, how are they going to be in escrow? So we want to manage what we really need to feel comfortable and secure versus how much are we playing on the seller's peace of mind and having that nice balancing act to get there. Number 8, the items included and excluded from the purchase price or from the sale. So are we asking the seller to include a bunch of personal belongings, furniture, paintings, anything like that? Or do we add on there what things we want them to take with them that might not be technically excluded generally? We could get into that. And number 9 is possession time frame, meaning from the time that it closes, the default in the contract is upon notification of recording, meaning congratulations, the home is now officially in your name being a buyer. How long after that time frame does the seller have a license to remain in possession? So we want to make sure that we either give them time to move their belongings out, which again, a standard customary practice is approximately 3 days after the close of escrow in order to allow the seller to get their belongings out. That way you're not coming in the front door and they're still stacking boxes in the living room. It kind of helps prevent an awkward situation potentially, but again, we could get into that. Bonus items. The strength of the financing. It's oftentimes just thought about that a pre-approval letter is a pre-approval letter, or I spoke with a lender and they told me we're good to go. There's actually multiple layers or levels of pre-approval or layers of strength of financing. Number 1 is what we call a pre-qual. Generally just comes from a 5-10 minute conversation with the lender. They say, yeah, cool, we can approve you for this. A pre-qual, or what I call verbal, right? You just talk to them on the phone, they tell it to you over the phone, you're good to go. Step 2 is a pre-approval, which I'll call visual, meaning you've shown them your tax returns, you've shown them your credit score, you've shown them your pay stubs to help actually show the lender above just a phone call that you actually do make what you say you make. So that's the visual aspect. The first one was verbal, second one visual. Now the next level is called DU approval. Now this is customary for a conventional style loan where they actually run it through a DU stands for desktop underwriter approval. It actually goes through an automated computer valuation that makes sure that it matches with Fannie Freddie guidelines so it can be sold on the secondary market. Long story, but that's another level is DU approval. Then the final step is what they call subject to approval, or sometimes called TBD approval, where it says that not only have we talked on the phone, not only has the lender visually seen your documents, but they've done another step of verifying. So they took the tax returns that you gave them, but they've also pulled the tax returns from the IRS to make sure that those match, to make sure there's no fraud involved. Not saying you would, I'm just saying it's happened. So the verification is they actually go through a manual underwriting process where they say you are formally approved subject to a clean appraisal and a clear title. It's also called a TBD approval because there's no address. They've gone through the entire process. It usually takes 2 to 3 weeks depending on lender workload, but that time's going to go by anyway. But if you're able to do all of that work ahead of time, you're able to have a significantly shortened escrow time frame. Traditional escrow time frames anywhere between 30, 45 days, depending on loan guidelines. However, if you're able to go through all of that, and now you're writing offers, you can potentially close escrow in as little as 14 days or so. Huge value when it comes to peace of mind for the seller. I'm sure you can appreciate that. Step 2, bonus item, proof of down payment funds. So not only are you just saying you have this amount of money in the bank, but you're actually with the offer supplying your most recent statement showing that you have that balance liquid, not in an investment account, not anywhere where you have to liquidate assets to then have the money. oftentimes in like stocks or 401ks that people might be pulling from, but showing you have liquid, ready to go assets right there and ready. Number three, buyer's agent's formal presentation and negotiation. Oftentimes an afterthought for a lot of lesser buyer agents who don't actually work hard for their clients. But a formal presentation where the buyer's agent puts it together in a nice, neat package. We make sure that we have a full dialogue and communication with the listing agent rather than just, hey, a little text saying, hey, check your email, just send an offer over. I'm a huge advocate of networking with other agents, having a good relationship and a good reputation. That way agents are waiting for our offer as opposed to just, oh, here you go, right? And then number four, huge one, is a phone call from the lender. Huge when it comes to when there's multiple offer situations and even just getting you the best deal, is having a lender being able to call the listing agent to answer any concerns with the lending or with the loan process, because that's primarily a seller's concern is, oh my goodness, can they actually get the loan that they say that they can? Because so often, especially with this crazy interest rate environment that we've been having, loans fall through time and time again. So making sure that you have a vetted lender go through that. So whether it is that you're using your trusted lender, if you would like referrals, more than happy to do that. So if you look down below here, this is the actual 16-page residential purchase agreement. As you can see, this is revised in June of 2022. They usually do it once to twice a year. 16 pages. My goodness, look at all this fun stuff, but I've highlighted the most important part. What you can do, I've included this for you down below, so make sure, excuse me, you download this, print it out, and review it as you'd like, but also would highly recommend let's get together to really strategize the best way in order for you, specifically for your situation, to come with the best way in order to write these. But I wanted to at least share with you. This is where you have the confirmation of agency relationship. So whether it is that you just want to verify what agent you're working with at that time, but the biggest difference between the big change that recently just happened in 2021 is they've added what I'll just call the matrix here, where there's this big table where it's a bunch of blanks. And this is really a synthesis of all of the negotiable terms, all in a row, all easy for you to see. But here are the most important ones. Of course, purchase price. This is one of the 2 times that it even addresses price at all in the entire contract, right? Close of escrow date, blank days after acceptance. Again, it depends upon how long it's going to take for your lender to get the loan dialed in and in combined with what the seller would like to do in terms of moving for there. So we want to match those dates up. Usually 30, 45 days, but most sellers would prefer for it to be a shortened escrow because that is a shortened window of being concerned or having a lack of peace of mind. Expiration of offer. It's important to note that as of signing this offer, there are 3 calendar days that this offer is valid until. I'm a huge advocate of shortening this time frame because the longer we give them, the longer that listing agent has to shop your offer in order to get more offers, because I don't want your offer and our offer to just be used as bait to get more. I want it to be the best possible deal for you. This is where it talks about the initial deposit amount. So if you look here, it has a blank number. A good general rule, again, is about 3% is considered a full deposit. And again, this is within 3 business days after acceptance by wire transfer. By default, we can modify those timeframes if possible. I'm a big advocate of getting it in sooner rather than later. As a listing agent, I always instruct and inform my sellers that if that initial deposit doesn't come in right away, that's the first hiccup and roadblock that I notice that this might be a challenging escrow. Okay, and increased deposit, usually don't have to deal with that. This is where we talk about the first loan amount. The initial loan amount in here, usually whether it be 80%, 90%, we usually think in terms of percentages that we have to put down, but the way the contract is written is the amount of money that you're getting a loan for. We can also we can also limit the amount of rate increase that there can be. So we actually put a limit in there of how high the loan can be in terms of percentage. Now, this doesn't dictate what loan you will get. This is just saying that the contract is set that we're agreeing to these terms and that the rate that you get cannot exceed a certain amount. So, because some people get concerned if we write it in here at a certain number, it's like, whoa, 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 my lender said I could get this. Okay, that's great. We can modify, but this doesn't dictate the loan percentage point that you end up getting. That comes from the lender in here. Default is conventional. All that fun. Additional financing amount if you need that. Occupancy type. If this is going to be a primary residence, that is the default on this contract. Now, if you're getting this as an investment property, second home, or whatever, that's where we have to dictate that here, because a lot of people aren't aware. Based upon how you plan to live or own this property will actually dictate the type of loan that you get, because you cannot get a primary residence interest rate by getting an investment property. There's generally a higher interest rate when it's an investment property, just because there's generally more risk for the lender on there. The balance of down payment, this is where that 20% down or whatever is left, and then that all adds up to the only second place where it talks about purchase price, and that's totaling it all up in here. Also, if you're getting any credits, like to pay down your interest rate or to help get closing cost assistance, this is where we would put that here. Also, additional financing terms. If we need to dictate anything else specific about your loan or what we need to do with it, we would put that in here. And again, by default, it says that you want to verify if it was an all cash or the verification of down payment. Remember, one of those bonus items, and the verification of loan application, that those are all defaulted as being already attached to the offer. Now, the next portion down here is called final verification of condition. Now, what this is after the entire transaction is done, within 5 days prior to the close of escrow, you get one last look at the property just to make sure that the property is maintained in its present physical as is condition, making sure that nothing's happened to the property. Also, if there were any agreed upon repairs that were done, we would just verify that, as well as get any receipts or reports about those repairs in there. Now, contingencies. This is where we talk about the 8 contingencies to get out of the transaction without losing your initial deposit. The first one is the loan, that you have by default 17 days to remove that contingency to get formal approval on the loan. Second one, the appraisal, to make sure that the home appraises for the value that you guys agreed upon in the purchase agreement. Sidebar with appraisals. They also measure, the appraiser also measures the home with a laser or possibly a manual measure. Sometimes that appraisal measurement comes back different than what is advertised in the MLS. That is actually not part of the appraisal contingency. So I want to make sure you are aware of it. During our investigation, we just want to verify the sizing and understand all the different measurements that have been done on the property. But that is one thing to keep in mind. But it is 17 days to make sure that you get that appraisal report back. The next one is the big one, L3, which is the investigation of property. By default, you have 17 days after acceptance to get all of your investigations done. Okay. Also, you do still have informational access, because if you notice, all of these say or blank days. It's very common, especially in a multiple offer environment, to shorten some of these time frames, and we could get into that on a one-on-one basis about what's the best ones to shorten at what time and for what reason. But regardless, if you shorten this investigation of property condition contingency to, let's say, 10 days or even 7 days if there were multiple offers, if you don't change this, you still have access to the property to do investigations. You just don't have what are called cancellation rights or a contingency at that time. Something to keep in mind. Also 17 days, if you notice a pattern, they're all 17 days, nice and easy to remember. You have 17 days to review the seller disclosure. So the seller is going to be asked very specific yes or no questions. It's going to be a huge packet of disclosures. The most important two are what are called the transfer disclosure statement and the seller property questionnaire, or the SPQ, seller property questionnaire. Those are the most important two, on top of what I do as a buyer's agent, which is called an agent visual inspection disclosure. It's big, complicated stuff, but you have 17 days to review all of those reports, okay? A preliminary title report, making sure that we are aware of any encumbrances or any liens or loans against the property. The beautiful thing is that you have the only insurance in the world that insures the past. All insurances are in the future, like when you get health insurance. You have to have health insurance before you break your arm in order for it to work. Where title insurance actually ensures that the property gets transferred to you as a home buyer free and clear of any of the seller's past encumbrances. So it's important to really review that. We'll go over that to make sure that it goes over exactly what is covered and what is not, and if there are any crazy things. So we have 17 days to go through that. Next one is a common interest disclosure. If the home is in a HOA or if it's a condo with CC&Rs, you get to review all of those items. A review of any leased or liened items. If there's solar panels, anything like that, you get in those seller disclosures, they have to list anything that is leased or liened that is going to be transferring with the property. Water softeners, solar panels, most common, right? Review of that, as well as the sale of buyer's property. So this is if you have to sell your current home in order to buy this next one, how we position that in there. Possession, time of possession. The default is upon notice of recordation, or basically, hey, we're good, we're signed, sealed, delivered in there. Or 6 p.m. on a specific date or different time if you want to put that in there. So again, if it is an owner-occupied home, it's generally considered customary or good standard practice to give the seller 3 additional days to move their belongings out. That's already driven into a seller's mind by a listing agent. It's important to know what's standard, if you will, because any deviation from the standard will make the seller concerned more, or it will make the seller concerned less. Part of the dialogue and part of the negotiation. If it was seller occupied or vacant units, same thing, COA end date, or blah, blah, blah. Tenant occupied, if there is tenant occupied, there's an additional form that usually you want to get the tenant out 5 days prior to the close of escrow. That way you can do your final walkthrough or your verification of property condition after the tenant has moved out. That way you can verify everything looks good. Very important. So making sure if we are looking at tenant occupied units, we definitely want to make sure that we have the right deal there. Delivery of possession. So all of this, the documents and everything, I don't want to bore you to tears with this, but it's important to know you're going to get all of the disclosures before you need to remove your contingencies, or else I will say do not remove the contingencies. So we can always talk about what happens after the fact. Items included in and excluded from, we would check everything that you want on in the property. Allocation of costs. When we get together one-on-one, I go over and we'll put together a template for you about what's considered customary, seller, both, all that. This is basically allocation of costs. Who pays for what, right? Generally, we want the seller to pay for pretty much everything, but the main thing is escrow is generally split each to pay their own terms. We can go over what that amount approximately comes out to. We also want to get you a home warranty plan. I'm a huge advocate of home warranty. Not everybody is. I've always utilized my own personal home warranties whenever I've purchased a home or anything like that. But we definitely want to make sure that we get you one. That way, if in the first year of you owning, one of the services or one of the appliances or anything in the home breaks or malfunctions that wasn't previously known about gets covered, and we can talk about limitations and everything like that that comes with home warranty, but want to make you aware of that. A lot of this, I'm going to be honest, is what I'll just call boilerplate, where I don't want to bore you to tears with this video, but that's why I included the full PDF for you to look and review on your own. But this just talks about additional addenda that we're going to incorporate into this agreement. If it comes to it, I'll talk to you about it. All of these items we kind of previously talked about, but let's get to the really important stuff. A lot of people ask, hey, Jacob, is this home sold as is? Right? Whenever you're looking at property, it's important to know per the contract in the RPA, every home in California, because this is from the California Association of Realtors, is sold as is, and its present physical condition as of the date of acceptance. Technically, every home in California is sold as is. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't inspect the property and make requests that things are changed. It's just important to note contractually, every home in California is sold as is. Key is as of the date of acceptance. This has happened before, where if the date of acceptance happened and you wrote an offer and the seller agrees, and then whether it be an earthquake or whether it be an issue that happens in the middle of escrow, the seller must correct the property to the condition that it was as of the date of acceptance. So that's an important note because I get that question a lot. Well, Jacob, what if something happens here? That's already pre-written into the agreement. Next, seller shall, on the close of escrow, unless otherwise agreed, even if seller remains in possession, provide keys, passwords, codes, and other means to operate all locks. So it is important to know you will get access to the property, even if you are allowing the seller to live there. Also, one of the things I did not mention is that the property, including pool, spa, all the fun stuff, must be maintained in substantially the same condition, meaning they need to make sure that the lawn is watered. They need to make sure that the pool is in disrepair or anything like that throughout that escrow process. Okay, you as a buyer are advised to investigate the insurability of the property. That is part of the investigation period, to investigate to make sure that there is insurability on the property. Big one in our area is fire insurance. There are certain areas that require specialty fire insurance. We'll go over in your specific situation. Buyer contractual obligations regarding deposit, balance of down payment, and closing costs are not contingencies of this agreement. This is why it's huge to make sure that we share with the seller that you have liquid funds. What happened early in 2022, a lot of the time buyers, because early in the year, or really 2021 into 2022 early, the stock market was rocking and roaring upwards. So buyers were saying, look, I want to keep my funds in the stock market as long as possible because I want to keep seeing those gains, because then it actually means that I have to bring in less out of pocket because I'm gaining more there. What happened is when that shift happened, all of a sudden that down payment that they had that was here all of a sudden dropped to there. And a lot of the time buyers didn't actually have the funds in order to bring into the transaction. It's important to note that your down payment is not a contingency of the sale. So you got to make sure that you have those funds liquid in there. Appraisal. Contingent upon a written appraisal at the amount specified, aka purchase price, unless otherwise agreed. It also talks about the measurements that we talked about before. This is a big one. The big one that we all want to talk about is the investigation of property. That this agreement is, as specified, contingent upon the buyer's acceptance of the condition and all other matters affecting the property. That's a big phrase. And any other matters affecting the property. You have to review the documents. We've already talked about all of this. Big one when it comes to removal of contingencies. So you actually, the big difference between California and many other states is that we have what are called active contingencies, which means that until you formally remove them in writing, those contingencies remain in effect. Many other states have what are called passive removal of contingencies. So if we have 17 days, day 18, contingency's gone. We in California have active removal of contingencies. So day 18, 19, 20, 21, those contingencies remain in effect until you as a buyer formally remove them in writing. So if the buyer does not remove a contingency within the time specified, seller, after first giving buyer a notice to buyer to perform, shall have the right to cancel this agreement. We'll get into that a little bit later. Important thing for items included in and excluded from the sale. Unfortunately, me being in a management background for real estate agents, I've had to have this conversation, but many agents aren't even aware of this, let alone buyers. So I want to save you some heartache potentially. It says, note to buyer and seller, items listed as included or excluded in the multiple listing service, flyers, marketing material, or disclosures are not included in the purchase price or excluded from the sale unless specified in this paragraph or in the matrix that was up above, okay? Or otherwise agreed. Any items herein are components of the home are not intended to affect price. All items are transferred to seller without warranty. Big thing to make sure that if the marketing material says washer and dryer are included in the sale, if it's not written on the purchase agreement, it is not included in the sale, because that happens a lot from lesser agents that they'll say, well, my goodness, well, why wasn't this included? And they go, I don't know, it was in the marketing materials, in the flyer. It does not matter. It specifically says, note to you, the buyer, that they're not included unless you include it in the offer. Very important, okay? It's going to be 2 pages of, what I'll just call boilerplate, fun stuff. This is the big one, investigation of property and matters affecting the property. Buyer, being you, within the time specified in that matrix, the default is 17, shall have the right at buyer's expense, unless otherwise agreed to, conduct inspections, investigations, tests, surveys, and other studies, aka buyer investigations, right? They're include but not limited to basically anything you want, as long as it is not invasive to the property in here. Very specific that you don't want to, that we're not going to punch holes in the wall and to investigate, because that is beyond the scope of this. Right? So it says, buyers shall neither make nor cause to be made invasive or destructive buyer investigations except for minimally invasive testing required to prepare a pest control report, aka termite report, where the termite inspector goes around poking little mini holes. Mini, right, is a qualifier, but you cannot just cut holes in the seller's floor to the ceiling or anything like that to investigate things. We have to get their permission to do so, okay? Now the seller, this is important to note, the seller shall make the property available for all buyer investigations within that time window, right? Seller is not obligated to move any existing personal property, important especially in garages and oh my goodness, all that stuff, right? Seller shall have water, gas, electricity, and all operable pilot lights on for buyer investigations and through the date of possession is delivered to buyer. So the seller needs to have on all the utilities and everything in order for you to be able to inspect. This is also, a lot of agents aren't even aware of this, but it's important to know, is that after you get your inspections, is that the buyer to give the seller at no cost complete copies of all reports obtained by the buyer, which obligations shall survive the termination of the agreement. Example, you paid an amount of money for an inspector to come out. Again, depends upon the inspector, the size of the home, and the package that you get, but inspections can be around, $500 to $750 potentially, depending on the size of home, for getting a home inspector to come out and take a look. Now, just because you paid for it, that doesn't mean that we can keep that from the seller, even if, based upon that inspection, you want to back out of the transaction. It actually survives the termination of this agreement. So if you back out, aka cancel this agreement, we still have to supply all of the copies of those tests and reports to the seller at no cost. We can't charge them amount of money or anything like that. Important to note, right? This is a big one when it comes to cancellation rights and making sure you get your money back as a deposit in case you want to back out. So this is an important one. I know that we've been going for a long time. I appreciate you bearing with me and sticking with me, but this is big because it comes to your money, your deal. Time periods, removal of contingencies, and cancellation rights. Okay, so buyer has the time specified in paragraph 3, aka that matrix, which was default to 17 days, to perform buyer investigations, right? Easy enough. Review all disclosures, reports, lease documents to be assumed by buyer pursuant to paragraph 9b, and other applicable information which buyer receives from seller, aka all the disclosures. And this is the big one, which is why I underlined it or highlighted it in pink or red, whatever color this is. Approve all matters affecting the property. That is the wonderful phrase that we can leverage in case there's any things that you have concern about. All matters affecting the property. So let's say you do an inspection. You love the property, but there are certain things that you genuinely have concerned about. What we have the ability to do per this agreement down here, buyer may, within the time specified in that 17-day time frame or whatever we write, to request that the seller make repairs or take other action regarding the property. It's called a request for repair, CAR form RR, where we say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we love the home. We just want these certain things repaired. Okay, the seller, as you can see that I highlighted here, the seller has no obligation to agree to your request or even to respond to the buyer's request. Because if you remember up above, it says all homes in California are sold as is. The seller may make repairs and it may behoove them in order to keep the transaction together to start all over again with the new buyer. But it's very important to know that the seller does not have to agree, nor does the seller have to even respond to that request. So it's important to note, but again, that's where it comes down to the negotiation portion of it. So a big question I get all the time is, Jacob, what happens? Let's say that we have 17 days. What happens on day 18, right? When you talk about the active removal versus passive, that's great that you say it, Jacob, but where is that written in the contract? That's where portion 4 comes in, the continuation of contingency, right? Even after the end of time specified in paragraph 3L, aka that matrix where all of those dates and time frames are laid out, and before seller cancels, if at all, pursuant to 14C, right down below, buyer retains the right. So you as a buyer retain the right in writing to either remove the remaining contingency or cancel this agreement based upon that remaining contingency. This is the clause that makes our contingencies here in California active contingency removals, because what it says, continuation of contingency, even after the end of time specified, that you retain the right, which means you still have the ability to cancel this agreement based upon remaining contingency. So as long as you don't remove it in writing, that contingency remains on day 18, 19, 20, 23, all the way to the close of escrow. So it's important to note. Caveat is, it says, unless the seller, if before seller cancels, if at all, paragraph 14C, which is right here, seller right to cancel. There's really only 2 ways that a seller can cancel unless the seller builds in an additional seller contingency. The cool thing about this is that if the seller does not additionally add anything else to this agreement, there is no seller contingency. That the seller cannot back out of the transaction so long as you hold up your end of the bargain. Example, let's say we negotiate a fantastic deal because we follow the steps that we outlined at the very beginning, that we maximize the seller's peace of mind and we get the offer in right away. We have a good relationship with the listing agent. I have a good communication with them. We negotiate a phenomenal deal. And they send us back that signed agreement. Awesome. We're all high-fiving, all that fun stuff. All of a sudden, a sweaty buyer's agent who's just a little too slow runs into the seller's house and says, I got a briefcase of cash for $100,000 more than you just agreed to. The seller cannot take that offer because they've already agreed to sell their home to you for this price and these terms. This is awesome, but it may incentivize the seller to want to do the other things here that we'll talk about. The seller's right to cancel based upon buyer contingencies. If by the time specified in this agreement, buyer does not deliver to seller a removal of the applicable contingency or cancellation, then the seller, after first delivering a notice to buyer to perform, may cancel this agreement. So what that means is, if you say that you're going to remove your contingencies within a certain period of time and you don't, the seller can cancel the agreement. However, question is, what happens to my initial deposit? Great question. In such event, I don't know why it doesn't let me highlight this. It's so weird. In such an event, seller shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit, except for fees incurred by buyer. So that just means if there are any fees that you just said, hey, inspector, I will pay you through escrow, or anything else that you're already agreeing to pay people through the escrow itself, they'll take that out of your initial deposit in there. But it says, if you don't remove the contingencies when you say that you are going to, and then the seller says, hey, we're going to cancel on you, and they do, they have to, per the agreement, contractually, return your deposit to you. Second way that they can cancel is based upon buyer contract obligations. Basically, you don't do the other stuff you said you would do. Example of this is you don't bring in your initial deposit when you say you do. You don't return reports when you say that you're supposed to. It's basically you don't hold up your end of the bargain. So as long as you hold up your end of the bargain, meaning you do the terms that you say that you're going to in this agreement, the seller cannot cancel on this agreement. The other way is, again, even in this such event, seller shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit. This is where I say 16 pages of buyer protection, because it specifically outlines how to protect that initial deposit that you put into escrow. It's what they like to call skin in the game, but if you know how to protect it, it's a very safe skin in the game, as long as you hold up your end of the bargain. The seller right to cancel seller contingencies. So the seller may cancel this agreement by good faith exercise of any seller contingency included in this agreement or otherwise agreed. By default, there are no seller contingencies to back out of the transaction. Those have to be manually added in with additional forms. Good to know. Okay. The buyer right to cancel. The big one is the buyer may cancel this agreement by good faith exercise of any buyer contingency included in paragraph 8, which are those 8 contingencies that they outlined, or otherwise agreed, so long as that contingency has not already been removed in writing. So you have to formally remove a contingency in writing, but once you remove it in writing, you then can't cancel because of that contingency, if that makes sense. So the key here is good faith exercise. You can't just say, I changed my mind, right? There has to be a good, valid reason. So it's important to know, I only want you to be writing offers on homes that you would want to live in, unless there was a good faith reason why you wouldn't want it, if that makes sense. But again, this is where we talk about having 16 pages of buyer protection, because it's all built in here. This is how you're able to back out of the transaction without risking that initial deposit if done correctly. So all of those seller ability to cancel said after first delivering to buyer a notice to buyer to perform. Important to know, what the heck is that, right? So a notice to buyer to perform is a formal document just like this that the seller must have it be in writing, signed by the seller, and give you 2 additional days after delivery to perform that activity. So let's say it's day 17 and you did not remove your contingency. The listing agent calls us up and says, hey, it's day 17, get us over that removal of contingency. I give you a call and say, hey, it's day 17. What do you think? What do you know? And you say, you know what? I'm not ready to remove it yet. Right? I still want to investigate some other things. I'm not sure about this or that, or whatever good faith reason you give me. I can then in turn go to the listing agent and say, hey, we're not prepared yet to remove those contingencies. We're still sorting out X, Y, or Z. If they issue you a notice to buyer to perform at that stage, it gives you 2 additional days to perform that activity before the seller may cancel. So that gives you potentially until day 19 to be able to confirm all those details that you might have questions about. And even if you at the end of that don't remove it and the seller does cancel, contractually it says, in such an event, seller shall authorize the buyer's deposit. Awesome, right? So the effect of the removal of contingency, right? This is where it explicitly states, which is why I highlighted it in pink, that if the buyer removes any contingency or cancellation rights, unless otherwise agreed, buyer shall conclusively been deemed to complete all buyer investigations, review of reports, elected to proceed with the transaction, and assumed all liability, responsibility, and expense for the non-delivery of any reports, disclosures, or any of that. This is why it's very important that I will say I will not recommend removing any contingencies unless we get all of the information that we have or that we need in order to properly be deemed conclusively to proceed with the transaction. I would rather you receive a notice to buyer to perform that you didn't remove it in the time that you were supposed to, as long as we didn't receive all of the documents you need to make a proper decision. I would rather you have a notice to buyer to perform than preemptively and prematurely remove any contingency, because your security and your safety is so vital to me. Repairs talks about how repairs are to be done. So repairs just need to be completed prior to the final verification of property condition, which again is within 5 days prior to the close of escrow, where we talk about right here. The time frame is in that matrix. The default is 5 days. So it just talks about how repairs can be made. All the fun stuff in here. Another series of boilerplate. This talks about attorney's fees. So this is whenever the seller, one of the big concerns is, what if the seller doesn't, right? What if the seller doesn't release my initial deposit? As a manager, back when I used to manage an office of over 100 agents, I had to invoke this paragraph and this clause a number of times to lesser brokers. You'd be surprised at how even the higher ups in this business don't read the contract. So not only is the seller potentially liable for a $1,000 fine, which I can go up to here, where it actually talks about if they refuse to sign mutual cancellation instructions, they can be fined $1,000 civil penalty. A lot of people say $1,000. What the heck? If my initial deposit is, let's say, $30,000 on $1 million home. But it also says that they would be liable for attorney's fees. And I don't know about you, but a good attorney, you sneeze on the phone to them and that's 15 grand, right? So I've utilized this many, many times in order to help kind of strong arm, if you will, lesser brokers in order to coax the seller in order to do it. It's important to know attorney's fees and costs, really interesting. But one of my favorite paragraphs is actually about definitions, because it's usually not the sexiest thing to talk about, but when we talk down to the nitty gritty, right, it talks about the as-is condition, that the seller must still disclose known material facts and defects. Just because it's sold as is, it doesn't it doesn't give them the ability to just say, well, I just take it as is, whatever. They still have to disclose what they know about the home, that the buyer has the right to inspect the property and request that the seller make repairs and exercise that contingency cancellation rights of this agreement. Seller is only required to make repairs specified in this agreement or as otherwise agreed. Another one, when we talk about days, the first day after an event. So let's say you get accepted on a Saturday. The next day would be Sunday, being day one, and that the following event and ending at 11:59 p.m. So if there's no date or time frame in there, the default is 11:59 p.m. All calendar days are counted in establishing the first day of an event. And then if the scheduled performance day for any act required by this agreement, including the close of escrow, lands on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, the performing party shall be allowed to perform the next day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. So let's say the scheduled close of escrow date based upon 30 days is a Saturday. It would actually be 31 days, which would be a Sunday, or Monday being 32 days. So that's the way it is. It defaults to the following day, not beforehand. in there. Liquidated damages, this is a big one in here. This is an optional paragraph, but I'll at least explain it to you on what it means and how it could be valuable to you. It says, by initialing the space below, you are agreeing to liquidated damages. Optional, not mandatory. If the buyer fails to complete this purchase because of buyer's default, meaning you remove your contingencies and then you try to cancel the agreement on something you're not allowed to, if that makes sense. Seller shall retain as liquidated damages the deposit actually paid. If the property is a dwelling with no more than 4 units, one of which the buyer intends to occupy, then the amount retained shall be no more than 3% of the purchase price. Any excess shall be returned to the buyer. That's a lot of legalese. So it says, if the buyer fails to complete this purchase because of buyer's default. So if you default on the contract by you executing and utilizing one of your rightful duties under the contract, because it says you may cancel because of this reason or may cancel, it's not defaulting. Defaulting just means going against the contract. And the only way to do that per this agreement is, let's say you remove your contingencies in writing and then you want to cancel the agreement, but you have no ability to cancel the agreement because you've removed your contingencies. At that point, that would be considered in default. It is not default by, in good faith, exercising your right to cancel based upon your contingencies. So only once you've removed your contingencies and then you cancel the agreement, we're pre-agreeing, if you initial, that the seller shall retain as liquidated damages the deposit you've actually paid, meaning we predetermine the amount that they are allowed to keep. They can't come after you for pain and suffering. If the market has dropped from X to Y, they can't come after you for more damages for that reason. So if you initial on this, you're predetermining what's to happen and limiting the amount of money that you could potentially lose based upon this agreement. Then it says, if the property is a dwelling of no more than 4 units, meaning if it's a condo, a townhome, a single-family residence, a duplex, triplex, or fourplex, not if it's a condo in a complex of less than 4. It could be a unit of 400, but if you're just purchasing one of the units, it's not like if you're buying an 8-unit apartment complex, this does not apply. And if you're intending to occupy this is not for if it's an investment property, but if this is an owner-occupied condo, townhome, single-family residence, duplex, triplex, fourplex, then the amount retained shall be no more than 3% of the purchase price, and any excess shall be returned to buyer. So if you want to predetermine and limit the amount of money you could potentially lose, you would initial this. I always will say consult with your attorney or trusted legal source. I will prep you in advance that every single attorney will say not to initial. I shouldn't say every single. Most attorneys will say not to initial here because they will argue that they could argue that the seller didn't actually incur that much damages. And they say, oh, I'll get it for you less. One thing I found through actual trial and error, if you will, on a management side, is that attorney's fees usually eat up any remaining balance anyway. So I have personally never seen a benefit of not including that on there. It's up to you. It's optional. It's for you to decide. But that was the run through of this agreement. I know this was a tall drink of water, but this is 16 pages of a legally binding contract, and I wanted to at least give you the time I feel that it deserves, because I know one thing, and that's knowledge is power. And when you have certainty, when you have confidence in writing the offer, you won't be scared to write an offer and potentially let a home that you love slip through your fingers, but it also gives you the confidence to write a great offer. If you know the loopholes and if you know where the pitfalls are, you can avoid them to help give you the best possible chance of success on getting the best deal possible. That's what I'm here to do. That's what I'm here to advise you to do. This is Jacob Lawlor, Lawlor Luxury Group, and I'll see you then.